All right. Hello. Hello, everyone. How's it going? Hopefully, once again, I've figured out some of the audio gremlins that have been nagging at me. Cool. Today, January 7th, January 2021, we are going to be talking about hybrid setups, specifically how you can use your iPad with hardware sequencers and hardware synths. So I'm going to be using the iPad Pro, my Squarp Instruments Pyramid for a hardware sequencer, and then I have obviously the Eurorack synth for the synthesizer. Cool. So if you guys have any questions, I do have chat open, let me know. Or if you guys end up watching this later and you have questions that you would like me to talk about, either directly in the comments or in future videos, put those in the comments of the video. So this is a patch I've been working on for a little while. I'll just play a little bit of it. The purpose is not really to necessarily demonstrate the music, because the music definitely needs work, but to demonstrate having the iPad as really the center hub. And you guys have probably seen this in other videos I've done or heard me talk about it, but just to give you an idea of what's going on here. So like I said, that's a quick, mostly just a sound demo, not necessarily representative of a real track, but just to give you an idea what's going on, what's capable. So I'm going to talk about some apps that I think you guys might want to be interested in, and just talk about general connectivity, signal routing, etc. So the first things first is this app, and I'm going to show this screen so you guys can see this. So this is an app called AUM. AUM is a very, very powerful mixer, and it really is a mixer. It's kind of the best way to think about it. You can have inputs that feed into outputs. It has a really powerful busing system. It has effect inserts. It has effect sends. And then the other really interesting, important part about AUM is its ability to do MIDI routing. So in a nutshell, and this is an example track that I have going on. What I have here, this is essentially my master track, this one. I'll wiggle it on the screen so you guys can see. So essentially the way and there are other ways to do this, but the way I have AUM set up is I have all of my other tracks feeding into this mix bus A, and mix bus A is the one that's actually going out to the audio on my interface. So that is a simple way I've set it up, so that way I can mix everything down to a single master track and then send that out. But there are other ways to do it too. You could go direct to the output of your interface. I like this. I think it's more convenient. I think it cleans things up a bit. So what is AUM really good at? Well, personally, I think AUM is really good for multi-track recording, and it is a very jammable application. I would not call it a DAW. There are proper DAWs for the iPad, and I can maybe show one of those a little bit later today. But really what AUM is good at is for just like a modular synth, combining things together, patching your way to victory to come up with you know, interesting sounds, making music kind of on the fly. And that part it's really handy for. So I'll show you just what a kind of blank session looks like. So this is an empty track. So when you first open AUM, it's going to look like this. You can add audio tracks. And like I said, audio gives you a pretty wide set of options here. So you can do things like the hardware inputs from your audio interface. So I have my audio interface connected via a USB hub, which I'll talk about in a minute. Or you can do things like other apps. So all of these AU or audio unit extensions you can bring in. So I can bring in something like, I don't know, this drum kit. And we'll play a little bit of that, right? So you can just hear it. Right? You get the idea. So you can bring in, there's a whole bunch of synth apps out there if you wanted to do just stuff on the iPad, which is perfectly fine. But for our purposes, we can bring in the Eurorack, right? I can bring in stuff from my external synth and bringing it into AUM. And I can do all my mixing in AUM. I can add effects. So let's say I wanted to add some reverb. So this is the Eventide black hole reverb. Right? I can get rid of that. I can bring in maybe, how about some distortion or something like that, right? Maybe I'll bring in the, where is it? Yes, lo-fi dirt. Right, something like that, something to give some color to my sound, you know, whatever you want, right? There's a ton of effects available to us to be using for the iPad. There's really no hard limit in terms of what you can use in terms of effects or synthesizers, etc., except for up at the top here, we do have this DSP graph. So just like on a normal DAW on a computer, at some point your CPU, essentially what happens is it gets too taxed out and it can't fill the buffer in time. And that's when you guys are hearing, if you guys ever have issues with like clicks or pops or anything like that with your audio interface, generally speaking, what's happening is the computer's failing to keep up with the buffer, and it's not able to kind of like backfill enough audio for the interface to then kind of render out and play to you. So same thing for the most part on the iPad. If it runs out of CPU power, if it's trying to do too much and it can't keep up, you will eventually start to hear your audio start to fall back. And then there's also some stability stuff where apps might start to crash. But for simple stuff like this, simple audio routing, you can see I'm not using any DSP, right? I'm just doing audio into audio, nothing's fancy. When I start adding effects, like if I bring back, maybe this is a stereo widener, right? You can see pretty low still, but I can make it mono. The more effects you bring in, the more synthesizer apps you bring in, the more usage you're putting onto the system, it's going to impact the performance of it. Pretty straightforward. So where AUM gets fun is there's basically an unlimited number of tracks I can have. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to set up a mix bus. I'm just going to eject these. And I'm going to use the mix bus. We'll bring back our little chord pad there. Right. So that actually brings us to our next point, which is MIDI routing. And this is one of the reasons I really, really, really love AUM, is how it does MIDI routing. It is the best, by far, the best MIDI routing app I have seen on any platform. And I'm still new, but both the iPad and the Mac, AUM does MIDI routing better than anything I've seen. Better than Ableton, better than Bitwig, better than Logic. Just does it better. And that's really has to do with this grid here, right? So the idea behind this is that you have your inputs and they go to outputs. So you can see I have the input from my pyramid, which is my hardware sequencer, just sitting next to me. That is the MIDI input, and I can route it to whatever destination I want, right? So I have the MIDI input going into the FH2, which is my MIDI to CV converter on my Eurorack. I have it going into the actual MIDI control system on AUM itself. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but with just like any other synthesizer app, you can control various parameters in turning stuff on, turning stuff off with MIDI CC control on AUM. Very, very powerful stuff. So you basically have full CC control of all of the mixing that you're doing within AUM. Very cool. I could route my MIDI input to software synths. So let's load one up and we'll do an example of that. We'll do a little drum kit. And there's other ways to do this here. I'm going to do it from this panel so you guys can see just how to, you can get really specific with it, which is nice. Oops. There we go. So one of the things that AUM does really nicely is built-in channel filtering for the most part. There's some exceptions to that, but for the most part it works just like you would expect. So for example, I know that on the current sequence I have set up, my drums are on MIDI channel 10 from the pyramid. So I can say channel 10 is the only thing I want going into this sequencer. There's some fun stuff around note ranges down here. So if I know there's only a specific set of notes that I want to go to this, for example, if I have only low notes or whatever, only the lower half of the keyboard I want to go to this synth versus the higher half I want to go to this synth, I can do that splitting here as well. You can do transposition here as well. Pretty cool stuff. And now if I play my drum track, turn that down a bit. So again, hardware sequencer controlling this drum synth in AUM. Pretty cool stuff. And that's all, you can see it again. Here's the MIDI routing. I've routed my pyramid MIDI output to the analog 909 app input for MIDI. Cool. What about hardware? So in this case, and this would apply to other synths as well, there's, depending on what you're connecting, you can connect as many USB hardware MIDI devices you want to AUM. They will all show up in this grid. So in this case, I only have one setup right now. That is the FH2, which is the MIDI to CV converter I'm using for my synth. It's right here, and it's connected over this nice red USB cable. And the cool thing about that is it shows up just here on the grid, just like anything else. It's sending all of the full 16 MIDI channels from the pyramid or whatever to the FH2. The one downside, and this is, if they were able to build this, that would be great, you don't get the same filtering options as you do on the software synths. And you can see this here. If I bring this up, this is clicking on that analog 909, that drum kit app. You can see here's the filtering options, here's the note range, stuff like that. I can show you, I can add or remove channels, etc. If I click on the FH2, that option is not there. So if anybody from AUM is watching, that would be a nice feature request to be able to do the MIDI filtering for hardware synths here. It is a kind of notably missing feature. So that is a downside of AUM, just to call it out. It's not a big one, I don't think. It hasn't affected me, but I also have a pretty simple setup in that I have basically one giant hardware synth that really does use, you know, all or most of the MIDI channels anyway, so I don't really have to care about the filtering. Let me just double check something. Can I? Yeah, see, you can't filter it on the input end either, so that's kind of annoying. There are ways around this. There are apps that you can get that are designed specifically to just do MIDI processing. So where it is. So this is just an example. This is one called MIDI Spy, and I can show you if I were to route the pyramid input into MIDI Spy. You can see it's getting the clock in. There's my notes coming in on that MIDI channel 10, and as well as the other ones that are going on. I can filter out these, just show notes. There are other apps out there which are pretty sweet, so you can do things like MIDI scripting, and I think I have it on here. I remember the name of it. Yes, there's an app called Streambiter, and this allows you, it's got like a little scripting language in it, and so you could actually write your own custom transposer, you know, remapper, channel converter, etc., channel filter, and there's example scripts in here as well to do it, but as a kind of workaround for some of the shortcomings of AUM's MIDI filtering on hardware stuff, you could, for example, incorporate your own script to filter out the channels that you don't care about, or reroute channels, etc., using some of the apps like this. And there are others out there. Like I said, this one is called Streambiter, Streambyter, and it does essentially a whole bunch of different things, including you can do things like MIDI remapping and stuff like that, which is handy. Let's see. So we talked about sequencing software synths, we talked about routing MIDI to hardware synths, and I don't know if you guys can see this. I'll just add it to the mix so you can hear it. This one? Yep. So these are those same drums. That same drum pattern is now sequencing this. Give me a little second to just add some compression on here so we can actually hear it. There we go. Let me mute this so you can just hear that. So one of the cool things, and this might be by luck, it might be a circumstance of my system, but you will note, if you listen carefully, the audio of these two, the hardware synth and the iPad app, are in sync. I don't know if that's luck. I don't know if that's circumstances in my system, but it is pretty impressive, right? You're not dealing with latency issues, at least that I've seen. You know, like I said, I can only speak to my setup, but for my purposes, it's been really good, and I haven't had any issues there, which is nice. So again, one of the nice things about AUM is being able to just kind of drop in effects. You know, you saw me drop in that compressor. I can open it back up. I can mess with settings and stuff like that. Very handy. Couple things I want to show. Where are you? So the other thing is that there's a lot of interesting MIDI sequencers available for AUM, or sorry, not for AUM, but for the iPad that function as these audio unit extensions. So this one, for example, is one called Fugue Machine. I'll load up just a preset just to kind of give you an idea of what it does. Sure. But the cool thing about this is that you can route these to There we go. Live demos. There we go. Now you can hear it. And let me. There we go. Not exactly anything to write home about, but it does work. We can actually speed it up so it sounds a bit better. Which playhead was that? You get the idea. The point is that you can use these software MIDI sequencers to actually sequence external instruments as well, in addition to internal ones. So in this case, using this very, very simple MIDI sequencer, I was able to send out multiple channels to the FH2 and then sequence my hardware sequencer, or my hardware synth, with that versus the pyramid. So you don't have to even use external sequencers if you don't want to or don't have them. Totally not necessary. There's a lot of great apps out there. Fugue Machine is a very kind of more generative one, I would say. And the basic premise of Fugue Machine is that you have one track that is shared across multiple playheads, and the rate of the playheads changes, the transposition of the playheads might change, but the notes are all common to each other. Obviously you can get fancier with that, but that one works. Another quick example would be something like Atom, which is a really kind of dirt simple piano roll. So if you want to do more piano roll style sequencing in AUM, you have that option as well. One you guys might have seen me try to mess around with the other day is one called LK. not that one. This one. I can click the right button this time, maybe. So LK is very similar to Atom in that it has this kind of piano roll. Whoops. Stop it. It has a kind of piano roll style sequencer, but it also is very Ableton-like in that you have this kind of clip launcher, scene launcher style performance aspect to it. I haven't dove into this too much. It is pretty deep, but it does seem pretty powerful as an option out there. And the nice thing is like cost. It's worth it while to talk about cost for a second. So AUM is not a free app, but it is about $20. And that is one of the best $20 you can spend for making music on the iPad. And then obviously the other apps we're looking at range from being free to some of the crazy, more expensive ones. For example, this Mixbox app, which is a really, really powerful effects engine. This is on the expensive end. This one I think was $50. But if you look at what you get for this, this is essentially an emulator of a 500 series, studio quality mixing system. It's an emulation, but it is really good. So I personally think this is $50 well spent. If you compare that to what actual hardware costs, it's a drop in the bucket. And you get really, really powerful software that is very capable. So I would say that there are stability concerns, even with the kind of processing power that the iPad has. It's not perfect. I've had apps crash on me. I've had interfaces disconnect. One thing that AUM does that actually really annoys me, and maybe hopefully they'll fix in the future, is that and I'm not going to do this because it's really irritating, but if I were to, for example, rip out the USB here, rather than kind of going to like a blank safe space, it will instead change the input on USB 1 here to be the microphone input and the output to be the speaker, and all of a sudden you have a nice feedback loop. So it doesn't even just go quiet, it actually just starts feedbacking on itself, which is a little irritating. Certainly not a deal breaker, and I will say, depending on what hardware you have connected to it, app crashes, at least in my current setup, with what I have connected now, I have had very few crashes or problems once I get it set up. And there's some kind of nuance there that I want to talk about now. So I'm going to go to my wide view, and I'm going to turn my self view off, so that way you guys can see what I have connected over here. So this little bundle of love over here, this is doing most of the heavy lifting. So with the iPad, with the newest iPad Pro and the newest iPad Air, they have USB-C on them instead of Lightning. So if you guys are in the market for an iPad and want to do music-related things, I strongly, strongly recommend, if you have the money for it, get an iPad that has USB-C. It doesn't need to be the 12-inch Pro. It doesn't even need to be a Pro anymore now that the Air is out with USB-C. But having USB-C on the iPad just makes a world of difference when you're trying to connect to things. So with USB-C, I just have this USB-C dongle that I bought off Amazon. It's some Chinese brand. It is fine. I haven't had any issues with it. I've only had this one a little bit. I've had issues with other ones, to be clear. But it has 3 USB-A ports, an HDMI out port, and hardware power pass-through. So it's charging my iPad as we're doing this. And then it also has USB card readers on it, both standard SD card and micro SD, which is nice. So all of that connected in the iPad, one cable. Very, very handy. So I have this white cable is going to my Pyramid. The red cable here is going to the FH2. And the black cable is being routed all the way around the desk down to my audio interface underneath my desk. Again, one cable into the iPad, everything just works, with air quotes on that. So nuances with how iPad deals with connecting things. This is not a Mac. It does not have some settings menu that you can go kind of endlessly fiddle with audio interface output settings. The way it works is it picks whatever was connected last, and that is the audio interface that you have to work with. Inputs and outputs, it seems to be pretty limitless in terms of like what the what the audio interface is sending and receiving. So for audio interfaces connected, I have a Motu 16A connected over USB. I get full access to all, right now I think it's like 24 inputs and outputs from the interface. If you had a bigger interface, presumably it would work up to the limits of what that interface is capable of. Now, some apps do have their own limits in terms of what they'll let you access. AUM is not one of them from what I've seen. If I were to open up a new audio channel here, I'll just do it on this one, for example. You can see I have access to all of the inputs from the audio interface. I have access to all of the outputs of my audio interface. Very, very powerful. Again, that in terms of, this is on like the top bar, if you will, in terms of what I/O is capable of. AUM allows access to basically everything. Other apps I've seen are more restrictive. It's one of those things you'd have to just kind of check app to app and make sure that it meets your needs. But again, if you're going to go for a default or looking for somewhere to start for kind of this hybrid setup, AUM really can't be beat as a kind of starter. So making sure that whatever you care about for audio is connected last matters. And it's a simple thing, but it is kind of annoying to deal with. There's no like settings you can go tweak to go change it once it's plugged in. You literally just unplug it, plug it back in again, and it tends to work. So for things like this, this USB hub, this USB hub here, the HDMI is actually considered an audio output and input. So for example, when I was getting this set up today, I actually plugged in the HDMI, then plugged in the audio interface again to make sure that the audio interface was again the most recent thing that was connected. So that way all of this would work as expected. Because I don't care about the audio from the HDMI. I only care about the audio from the audio interface. So that's one kind of nuance to talk about from a hardware perspective. Other than that, the only requirement really that I've seen, and again, this is where you would need to check on your specific equipment, but making sure that your hardware is quote unquote class compliant. So if you're using a Mac, for example, if your device uses the core audio drivers versus needing to install their own drivers, if it's using core audio, chances are it will probably work. Don't quote me on that, and definitely do your homework before. Don't just rely on me saying that, but from what I've seen, class compliant, core audio supported audio interfaces tend to work on the iPad, which is great. If you have fancier stuff or stuff that is doing kind of like hybrid roles, so if you had like a sequencer, or you can imagine like something like the Digitact or Electron, those might be weird just because they have both audio and MIDI capabilities. I'm not too sure. You'd have to go look. Do your homework just to check that. MIDI, again, same thing, MIDI USB. If you have class compliant MIDI devices, MIDI devices, not hosts, important to think about, but those should work as well. So if you have, for example, this is a class compliant MIDI device, I plug it in, shows up, looks great. I have a couple other keyboards up here, plug them in, they work well, no issues. Another hardware sequencer works fine. I have yet to, knock on wood, I have yet to have an issue with a class compliant MIDI device that didn't get picked up or recognized by the iPad. So, food for thought. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about? AUM clock is a little strange. And let me go back to the PC screen. And I'll hide myself here because this is an awkward space for it. But so AUM has a clock. It can send MIDI clock, which is useful, but it can only send it to exactly one device, which is not useful. And it cannot receive MIDI clock, which is really not useful. So some apps will default, and this is specific to apps. But for example, this 909 app, it wants to use the MIDI clock. And you can see if I start playing, it's actually doing the sequences on here. We can actually, there's probably one loaded somewhere. Right. So that's tied to the AUM clock, not to another external clock. So for example, I've been using my pyramid as my main clock because it's, you know, rock solid and it syncs with everything I need to. There is no easy way, and I say easy with air quotes around it, there's no easy way to use an external MIDI clock to sequence AUM itself. So like I said, AUM can record, it uses BPMs to do recording, its own internal sequencer for things like apps that have their own internal sequencers, it gets routed like that. There's no easy way to do that. However, what you can do is you can do Ableton Link. So if you had an Ableton Link, you know, device or session going, you can have AUM join that, and that it will default its master clock to whatever the Ableton Link master clock is. So I've heard, but I have yet to try. There are apps out there that allow you to create Ableton Link sessions within the app, and then AUM can read that. So that's what I've heard on the web. I have not tried that because I have not needed it yet, but it's worth calling out as a potential concern if that's something that you care about. The one thing that is not clear, but it does happen, is that AUM will transport MIDI clock messages from hardware devices, just not to itself, which is a weird inconsistency, but you know, it is what it is. So the nice thing is, you know, and I'll show this on the wider screen because you'll probably be able to see it better, but if I hit start on my pyramid, you can see I have one of my channels on my FH2 is dedicated to clock divisions. And that is the MIDI clock from the pyramid being divided out, you know, across various channels on the FH2. And that works like you would expect. And there's no special routing here, it just does it. And I wish it was actually a little more clear about that it was transporting MIDI clock, if you wanted to do some sort of offsetting or something like that. But again, AUM does not have that at the moment. So again, anybody from AUM listening, I love your app. Couple little things. Ugh. Chef's kiss on the top would be perfect. Let's see. Yeah, I don't have too much else to cover here. I think that gives you a pretty good guide on how to get started. So I'll talk about how, really quick, just what I'm doing for audio routing. I have these two, and this is specific to Eurorack, but the audio part after it gets to the Eurorack, or gets to the interface, might be more interesting. But I have these two NW2S IO modules, and what they do is they take Eurorack level both in and out and convert it to line level in and out. And then they send it over a couple DB25 snakes each. So behind the case, I have 4 DB25 snakes out, and they're going into my audio interface. And then my audio interface is being obviously connected via USB to my iPad. And that's been really handy for me. You know, I don't have any kind of cables here going like off somewhere. It's all happening on the back of the case, which is really handy. But the nice thing is, you know, once it's in the audio interface, it's coming into the iPad pretty cleanly, and I don't really have any issues there. I can do, because these modules are bidirectional, I can actually do hardware sends. So for example, if I wanted to, let's just say I wanted to route the audio from the 909 app. So from the app, I want to route that back out to the modular. So I can do a hardware send within the AUM, and I can send that to whatever hardware output I want. So in this case, I'm going to send that out to, I think I have it set up to 3 and 4. We can just play that. Maybe that wasn't it. Which one did I send that to? Oh, did I break this? Maybe that's why. in. There we go. Oops, that's loud. Why are you so loud? So I want to send this to hardware, and I'm going to send it to 3 and 4. Ah, yes, there we go. I don't know if you guys can see this, but now that audio is actually coming out of the modular. So if I wanted to, just as a kind of hypothetical here, let's patch it into the monsoon. Why not? And we can take the monsoon output and then patch it back into one of our inputs over here. That's right. This needs to be posted here. So that might be a little bit loud, but hopefully it sounds okay now. So now I have drums, in this case just an example, but I'm routing it, out to the Euro rack and then back into my iPad. So you can do, any sort of kind of insert or sidechain effect like that. The one thing I haven't been able to figure out is if you can do direct hardware inserts. So for example, this is doing more of like a hardware send rather than an insert. Don't know yet if you can do a true, the full signal goes out. You do not hear anything until it comes back in with hardware. There's a workaround to that, which is you can actually do multiple channels. So for example, if I, rather than sending this to a mix bus A, I could send this directly to our hardware output, and then this should also still work. So now if we change the wet blending, it sounds weird, but it is working. So if we solo these, and I have no clue what mode I have this in, but kind of fun actually. So that is a way that you can do true inserts. It's a little kind of kludgy, I would say, just because you have to have multiple, let me show this, sorry, on the screen. You have to have multiple tracks here. So like I have to have both of these in order for them to work. outputted this directly to the hardware and then the hardware back in again. And theoretically, I can chain these as much as I want, but you know, in terms of, it does take up more space on the screen, just as a limit. So it does work though, which is cool. All right, let's see. Recording. So again, multi-track recording is really handy. Because of the clock thing I was talking about earlier, there's some weirdness there specifically. So for example, and this is a good way to demonstrate that. So I have, before I turn on this, I have a sequence with its own clock playing from the pyramid. But let's say I wanted to record that. I can arm the record and I can hit record. And now you can hear, because of the way the clocking works, when I start to record, it's actually using the internal sequencer on this app because it's getting timing, which is a little irritating. So I mean, I can turn this off really easily and it won't matter anymore. But again, kind of dumb thing. Now if I hit play on here, it's actually getting the proper sequence. It doesn't care about this part. This is really only just for the tracking part, but it does work. And I'm recording audio in, right? Nothing crazy, and it's working like you would expect. The cool thing is that because of the way the multi-tracking works, you can kind of record at any level. So you can see I'm recording both the completely dry signal, dry in this case because there's nothing on the track, but I'm recording the dry signal as it's going out to the synth, and I'm also recording the now wet signal as it's coming back in. So if we actually stop, we can go play back and listen to these. So here is that dry signal, which this might be very loud. Oh no, this was... Which one do I want? I want this one. So this is the dry signal. I'm sorry, that's a little bit loud, but... So again, that's the dry signal as it's going out to the Euro rack, and then this is the wet signal coming back in. So now I have the stems for both of those, and if I wanted to just totally remix the thing later and not use the wet, or only use the wet, or vice versa, I have those options as well. And the filing is pretty nice. It's all contained within AUM. I can share this out. I can airdrop it to my computer if I wanted to pull it up on another DAW, and it's all available to me, which is handy. Let's see, anything else really to talk about? I don't think so, not with AUM. Let's just talk about some cool apps, the things I think you should check out. So I already talked a little bit about Mixbox, which is a kind of 500 series emulator, like a console emulator. So like there's reverbs, choruses, EQs, compressors, limiters, etc., etc., etc. You can do all of your mixing with this, which is really nice. It does seem to be a little bit kind of CPU intensive when you start to get multiple instances of it going, but it does work, which is cool. I was running it, and I'll pull up my other session that I had. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instances of it going. And you can see I'm sitting at about 60% CPU utilization on this. And I've noticed, based on other people's videos and stuff like that, you really can push it all the way up to, 90, 100% before you start hearing issues. It's once you go past that 100% threshold that it starts to become a problem. Anything short of that is fine, which is nice. So even though I'm at 50, 60% here, that's actually plenty of headroom to do basically whatever I wanted to. So I can load up more instances, I can load up other effects, etc. Let's see, I'm going to turn this down. What else to talk about? So the Eventide series is really cool. There's a whole bunch of reverb, chorus effects, etc. This is the same people that make all of the proper VST plugins. I think they make hardware effects as well, though I probably don't have the budget for those. Really powerful stuff, and it's in an app, and apps are actually pretty affordable. Even if they're, for an app, they are expensive. I think if you're used to iPhone or iPad apps costing like free to $2, these are going to be more, just honestly. Like I said, AUM is a $20 app, which sounds like a lot for an app, but if you compare it to something like Ableton, Ableton's a $700 app. right? And it's obviously not the same feature set, but it gives you an idea of what the kind of order of magnitude difference is in terms of the prices for these things. Again, 100% worth it in my mind. Let's see, there's all sorts of cool synth apps. Things like Drombo, which we showed the other day, really cool. Oh yes, okay. So these ones are amazing. The 4 Rockets apps, or 4 Pockets, I guess is what it says. So this one, for example, is an audio analyzer. So I get a full spectrograph. That's cool. It's also a tuner. So if I wanted to try and tune, that's very handy. We can put it on an actual... Yeah, I think it's this one. Very handy tuner. So especially if you have something like Eurorack that doesn't have a tuner built in, that's really handy to have. I've used that many times to tune oscillators. It does have this note detection thing, which is a little kind of weird, but very powerful kind of analysis suite. It doesn't, actually change the sound at all, but it does help trying to understand what's going on. They also have, let's see, where'd they go? Let's see, analyzer, compressor, graphical EQ, harmonizer, multiband compressor. They have their own, similar to Mixbox, where you can build out a kind of rack of things, a rack of effects, and tie them all together internally to that little app. Shimmer, chorus, things like that. These effects I really like. They're very handy. This one I haven't had a chance to play with too much, but it's an envelope follower, which is really cool. So you can actually generate an envelope and then use that envelope as MIDI CC to other things. Reason I want to play with that is to be able to basically take audio and turn that into CV, audio from an app and turn that into CV on the synth, which is cool. So I can actually take those MIDI CCs and output them into the FH2, which is really neat. So I haven't had a chance too much to play with that, but I did pick it up the other day, and I'm looking forward to messing around with it. Oh, this one. If you are a Eurorack person, this one is a must-have. This is really, really cool. If you guys are familiar at all with Silent Ways, Silent Ways or MIDI or CV tools in Ableton is basically a way to send CV control out your audio interface and then into your Eurorack. So if you didn't have something like the FH2, but instead just had a DC coupled audio interface, you can actually send CV, including pitch and gate and clock and stuff like that. Covariant is a handy little AU extension which does the same thing on the iPad and is the only one I've found that does it, and it actually does a really good job of it. It includes the self-calibration for oscillators in terms of mapping outputs from your interface to a proper pitch so it stays in tune. It will do that for you, which is sweet. It will do envelope generation, it will do clock output. All the things you can think of using something like CV tools for, you can use Covariant for the most part. And it does a decent job. There was a little kind of just learning curve on it in terms of like you have to set up multiple tracks, multiple AU effects in order to get it to work, but it does work pretty well, which is nice. So if you didn't have something as kind of full-featured as the FH2 to do all of your MIDI to CV, you could use something like that instead, and it will work like you would want it to. All right, I have talked myself to death. I think I'm going to call it a night. So thank you guys for tuning in if you tuned in at all. If you guys have questions on all of this, please let me know. I know there was a lot to cover and talk about here, and I definitely didn't get to everything, but if there's stuff that you would like me to cover that I missed, or you guys just have direct questions, let me know in the comments, and I will address them. Other than that, I will see you guys next time. Stay tuned, hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.